Bev, it is a process where you have to go through almost fragments of evidence that took place at that site near the hospital in Gaza City. We not only have the questions about what exactly hit that hospital, whether it was Israeli munitions or whether it was from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a rocket that was intercepted or fell short. We also have questions about the death toll in the Gaza hospital. But here's my starting point, and I think it's fundamental to what we're going to discuss about the wider impact of this conflict. Had Hamas not begun this cycle of violence on October 7th by a ground assault inside Israel and carrying out the mass murder of Israeli nationals and foreign nationals, had Israel not responded with the extensive bombing across the Gaza Strip, which whoever was responsible for the hospital bombing day before yesterday has killed thousands of Gazan civilians. If those things don't happen, those people in that Al-Ahli Hospital in Gaza City would be alive today. So it's a question, I think, not of going back in terms of one side or the other in terms of responsibility. Both Hamas and the Israeli leadership are responsible for mass murders on both sides. And the question is how you break that cycle of violence.
Yes, how you break that cycle of violence as there is this growing anger in the Arab world that could then spill over. So let's look at the individual protests that are going on and how the leaders of those countries manage those protests.
Right. And again, Bev, you almost have to go country by country to talk about this. And I'm going to make, an initial point, which is that for most of the countries in the region, Arab countries, and I'll include Turkey here, they've got their own interest in play here. And I have to say with regret that not just for the past couple of weeks, but for decades, civilians have been pawns, especially civilians in Palestine have been pawns of these governments. Let's take Turkey, for example, where we saw a lot of the protests. Look, there are tactics by the Turkish government of President Erdogan to allow these protests. They won't let them get out of control. They will limit them with security forces. But Erdogan wants to show, I'm very upset about this. I'm very much on the side of the Palestinian people. Look at me. I'm a leader of the Islamic world. If you talk about Jordan, where you have these protests, the interest of the leadership, as it has been for decades, is just to survive. There's a very large Palestinian population in Jordan. In the past, violence in the region and in Palestine has spilled over into Jordan and threatened the security of that country. They'll want to try to contain that. So they'll let the protests go, but they don't want them to go too far. Saudi Arabia, which keeps a pretty firm lid on protest inside that country, will try to maneuver by keeping its head down in a very strange way. They're not going to say too much to come out, certainly in condemning Hamas. On the other side, while condemning, the violence in Gaza, they still have a developing relationship with Israel, even if normalization is off the table for now. So I have to say that the fundamental here is, if you really want to deal with these protests across the region, you've got to go back and provide a lasting solution for stability and security in Israel and Palestine. How do we get to that? Well, if you want me to, I'll give you that answer in just a moment.
Yeah. Well, I would like to get an answer to you on that, but I'm interested too, Scott, in your thoughts now. We've had all these diplomatic missions, if you will, where Israel sees them as obviously supporters. We've seen from Biden, Rishi Sunak today, support for Israel to counter the Hamas attacks. But what has happened to that momentum, do you think, for that ground invasion when we are already seeing such destruction in Gaza, such a humanitarian crisis?
Yeah, I think the messages, and it's important to say, it's not just from the US, it's not just from the UK, it's from much of the international community, including Australia, has been twofold. And this has been the case since soon after the Hamas attacks. First point, Hamas crossed the line. They crossed the line as being a leadership in Gaza that can provide for security and stability when they carried out those mass murders in Israel. And most of the international community, including Australia, is saying to Israel, we realize that Hamas and behind it Iran have to be contained, and Hamas should actually be removed from leadership. But point two, and here's the key point, how do you do it? And what is being said to the Israeli leadership, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, is you don't do it through a ground invasion. You don't do it through indiscriminate bombing that kills these thousands of civilians, because it won't work. It will only push the civilians into the arms of Hamas as their protector. So you've got to find a way to pull back from the immediate cycle of violence and then talk about the steps, political, economic, and security steps, to carry out that isolation from Hamas. Now, in the past 48 hours, we've seen a disruption to that. We saw a disruption to that because of the very visible hospital attack, and the discussion of who was responsible. And it was disrupted yesterday, actually, by Joe Biden, who stumbled in his initial statement alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu, did not come out strongly enough for Palestinian civilians. He did do so later in the day. So it's getting that message back across. And here is key. You can talk about humanitarian aid and you can make commitments. The Americans, $100 million. Other countries making commitments. You have got to get that humanitarian aid into Gaza. You've got to open the Rafah crossing from Egypt. 20 trucks is not going to be enough, which is the token announcement made for today. It's got to be a sustained effort with buy-in from the international community and indeed from the Israelis to allow that aid to come in on a sustained basis.
Yeah. And what you were talking about earlier, Scott, is really about exercising restraint, which we have seen very little of, and we are unlikely to see from Israel in the really what looks like the early days of this conflict. Coming back to your point, what is the recipe? What is the equation that we need to try and stabilize?
Now, I'll make a provocative statement and then give you a sting in the tail on it. The provocative statement is that this conflict does not end. It might be eased for a bit, but it does not end until you remove the leaderships responsible for this conflict. That means Hamas has got to go in Gaza. It means Prime Minister Netanyahu has got to go in Israel. And although Israel is still carrying out the attack, civilians are still being killed, Hamas leaders are being killed, there are signs that within the war cabinet, especially watch a guy named Benny Gantz, the former chief of defense staff who's in that war cabinet, they're trying to contain Netanyahu. Benny Gantz said today, look, this is going to be a protracted conflict, but it is one which is not only about eliminating Hamas, we've got to provide for recovery in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Now that might be the opening for the international community to bring in the aid to bypass Hamas, with the deal being, look, you've got to give something to Gazan civilians, which is not just another 16 years of an Israeli blockade, if you're going to have a lasting solution here.
Yeah. Scott, always sobering to talk with you and appreciate it as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.